Welcome to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. I interview leaders, experts and business professionals from around the world who are bringing leadership principles and know-how into the digitally driven 21st century workplace, with focus firmly on the how-to rather than the what. Each episode is in aid of a charity chosen by my guests, and since 2020, we've made donations to over 80 global and local causes. Welcome to Fabrice Desmarescaux, my guest for this episode of the Rethink Leadership podcast. Born and raised in France, Fabrice has spent most of his working life in Asia, where he's been a business executive for over 30 years. In the last 15, Fabrice has pursued his passion for helping clients reach their full potential through coaching, consulting, deeper meaning, contemplation, and more. In fact, he's an accredited International Coaching Federation PCC level, a certified yoga teacher, and proficient in utilising various leading psychometric tools. He's also the author of the book The Art of Retreats, which helps leaders lead more intentionally, consciously, and compassionately, something that comes into his coaching, his consulting, and teachings throughout. This episode is in aid of Food from the Heart, Fabrice's charity of choice in Singapore, to which we've made a donation as a thank you. Fabrice, thank you very, very much for joining me. Please introduce yourself, your business, and tell us about your book, The Art of Retreats.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm really happy to do this. So I'm a business executive. I worked in business for many years. I started my career as a strategy consultant in the banking world, and I became a banker, and that was the first 20 years of my life. Ended up being a senior banking executive running a consumer bank with 500 branches and a few thousand people and all the products that you typically find in a consumer bank. So that's phase one. Phase two, and we can talk about the transition because it's not necessarily an obvious one, but I became a leadership coach and a leadership consultant. I worked in executive search and supported literally thousands of senior executives in their career evolution and transition. I was part of a large global executive search firm, and in that capacity, I recruited many senior executives. I interviewed even more. And over the years, I discovered that I loved actually the part where I would sit down with a senior executive and try to help them make sense of their life and make sense of their career. That led me to executive coaching and top team coaching, where I work with CEOs and their teams. And so that's been phase two. And in parallel, I've had always, I would describe myself as a spiritual seeker. And so, unfortunately, maybe not a spiritual finder, but a seeker for sure. and therefore, I've always incorporated the search for purpose and the search for meaning and contributing to something that's greater than us. You know, yes, we need jobs. Yes, we need careers because we make money, and that allows us to support our families, to support our interests, our pleasure, our hobbies, puts a roof over our head. But if it's just a job or just a career, in my view, it's not enough. And my experience is that people who just have a job or just have a career have something that's missing in them. And at some point, very often, there's the days of waking up and looking back and say, oh my God, you know, I've been very successful and I feel very empty. And so I combine these three, you know, my business experience with my understanding of career dynamics and executive coaching with my spiritual interests, and I bring that into my practice. Today, I'm a partner at McKinsey, and I lead our leadership development practice in Asia. So it's the perfect place if you want to access Asia's largest corporations, work with some of the most senior executives, and bring what is truly my passion. Occasionally I tell my colleagues at McKinsey, you know, I would continue doing this for free if I wasn't paid by the firm. Obviously, don't take that too seriously, but it's true. It is truly my passion, and And I cannot think of a better place to do than to do it in a firm like McKinsey, which has tremendous access and tremendous insights into transforming corporations. So that's me.
And great. And it's obviously, I mean, you put a lot of that into your book, The Art of Retreat. Just tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, the art of retreat is really the art of slowing down in order to reconnect with our inner self. Now, why do I believe this is important? And obviously, not everyone will have an interest to connect with their inner self. They say, I'm very happy in the outer world. I'm very happy in the world of doing, and I've been very successful. And I say, yes, that's all fine, right? There is an outer world that we can measure with metrics, right? So typically, the outer world is what we can see, what we can touch, and what we can measure. And that's the corporate world. That's the world that has profit numbers and KPIs and market share and market cap and you want a number for everything, and that's perfectly fine. It's a world that if you put a CCTV in a room, you can observe and you can measure. It's the tangible world, and so we live immersed in this world of tangible. That's very good. That has produced many benefits for mankind, right? That's the reason why plane flies and train run on time, and a lot of good things happen to us. But there's also the inner world, and the inner world, both the personal inner world. So what is my soul journey? What is happening inside? Am I mentally and psychologically stable and fulfilled? And am I enjoying the emotions that I'm experiencing? Do I even understand them? And there's also the collective inner world, right? What is our corporate culture, for example? This is not something you can put a number on, right? And so we participate in an inner world, but we've been conditioned to ignore it in a way. And if you go to a corporate meeting and you say, I feel a little bit sad today, or I feel first, you're not paid to be emotional. Just tell us what your numbers are going to be this month, right? There's no credits to be gained by expressing emotions and being in touch with our emotions. And culture, of course, every leader will talk about culture and the culture is important. It's our differentiator. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, blah, blah, blah. But most pay lip service to it. When I say, let's look at your culture, and maybe there's some aspects of your culture that could be improved in service of greater achievements and greater fulfillment, they say, well, what's the ROI here? How much am I going to, and we translate everything that is internal into the world of tangible without understanding that these two worlds are actually very orthogonal. They're completely separate worlds. You cannot quantify the inner experience, not anymore that you can put intangible, spiritual, and emotional value on the outer world. So there's two very different worlds. They don't communicate, even though they're intimately interconnected. And in the corporate world, we tend to focus on the outer and we tend to ignore the inner world. So my book, The Art of Retreat, is really to reconnect leaders with their inner world, a world that they have been conditioned, trained, forced, pushed to ignore for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And that's it. So I call it the art of retreat, because the retreat, which is really the place of silence and solitude in an inspiring space where you can reconnect with your soul, the retreat is the gateway to this inner world. Now, when I say that, a lot of people are going to say, well, Fabrice is completely new age, he's gone off the rails, etc. But if you go back just a few centuries ago, potentially before this era of modernity, the inner world, the inner experience was extremely present. We had a very strong appreciation for the spiritual. In fact, probably a little bit too much, because at least in the Western world, the church was telling you what to think. Right? There was no measurement, no science when Galileo or Copernicus were telling you that no, the sun doesn't revolve around the earth. They would be burnt on the altar. And so, the church, which is the spiritual realm, was telling you how to think and how to behave and how to measure. And with the event of modernity, these worlds started separating, and we started more and more ignoring the inner world, the world of emotions, the world of spirituality, the world of culture, and we just focused on the outer world. And so my book is an attempt to reestablish the balance for leaders, to say, yes, there's an outer world, which is extremely important because that's how we get measured, but you're not going to achieve lasting fulfillment and lasting satisfaction and balance and purpose without a deep connection to your inner world as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear you speak. And when we go right back to the beginning of what you were talking about, us as leaders contributing to something greater than ourselves, sometimes we're caught so much in that short term that we don't do, and we can lose ourselves. And you echo my own journey. Actually, I'm listening to you speak just there, and it's only when I got in touch or back in touch with the real me, the internal me, that I started to expand my horizons again and started to create my own way forward, and understand what was really important, not just to me, but to in my life, in business, and into the communities within which I serve. So I really buy into that point that you're making, is that this could be a fundamental game changer for some leaders to become more conscious and intentional about how they lead. And that's something I would like to ask you about, Fabrice, because you're a champion of conscious leadership in this respect. For those that hear the term but aren't quite sure what that means, could you define it for us and what it means for today in the modern business environment in which we operate?
Conscious leadership is nothing more complicated than leading with an understanding of what are the broader holistic implications, if you want, of your actions, right? As a leader, I have great power, I have access to resources, and therefore I have great responsibilities. Very often, we take our responsibilities with too narrow a focus. We say, my responsibility is to deliver profits. My responsibility is to deliver the bottom line. My responsibility is to deliver growth. My responsibility is to deliver shareholder value. That is very narrow. This is incredibly shallow if you think of it. Because if that is your responsibility, then the end justifying the means, you can do almost anything to justify delivering the bottom line. And without any bad intentions, we see corporations the world over essentially taking all the shortcuts and that lead to environmental destruction, inequalities, mental health issues in the workplace, because it doesn't matter. We don't need to quantify these externalities because I'm just focusing on the bottom line. And yes, of course, now we have ESG considerations, we have B Corp, we have a number, but the reality is no one cares about this. For having hundreds of discussions with CEOs every year, I can tell you that yes, it's important. Yeah, of course, we want to protect the earth. Of course, we don't want the climate to change. Of course, I would like my grandchildren not to be fried alive. Of course, who's going to disagree with that? But what are you going to do during the next quarter that is going to have a positive impact on climate change, environmental preservation, society, harmony, etc.? And the answer is nothing. Not nothing because you're a bad person as a leader, but nothing because you operate in a system that has absolutely no incentives for you to do anything. In fact, there's very strong disincentives if you try to do anything, because your shareholders are going to come after you and they're going to say, what are you doing? I thought you were here to maximize growth. I thought you were here to maximize profits. And instead, you're wasting resources to do A, B, C, D. And unless it is absolutely mandatory by regulation, we don't want you to go the extra mile. So just focusing on the numbers leads to dysfunctions in our environment. And so conscious leadership is an appreciation of the holistic impact of leadership, and then an effort, not a I would say a naive view that, oh, I need to protect the animals, I need to do it, because you're going to get fired if you do that, right? So we need to be very pragmatic, but there's leeway. When you're a CEO of a corporation, you have a lot of leeway, and you can influence your employees, you can influence your shareholders, you can influence the rest of the stakeholders, you can work with the regulators to try to have more positive externalities on the all aspects of what you do in your leadership. So that's but it starts with an understanding. It doesn't start with an outcome in mind. It starts with, first, a deep reflection to say, what is it as a leader that I'm actually creating today? And you can look at the different stakeholders, you can look at your employees, you can look at your suppliers, you can look at your customers, you can look at the environment, the societies in which you operate, and take a hard look. And maybe do it with a thought partner who's not going to hide the truth from you, and say, am I really doing what I want to be doing? Am I really proud of everything I'm doing? And the picture, in my experience, is rarely completely black or completely white. Right? There's a lot of corporations who do a lot of good in the world, if only because they enable their customers to do things that would not be possible. They give a way of making a very decent living to their employees, etc. So it's never black and white, but I think leaders can go a lot deeper in an appreciation of their holistic impact. So that's for me, conscious leadership.
It's again interesting to hear you talk about this, and I completely agree. It's those broader implications of what I say, what I decide, what I do, how I interact with others, all of those kind of things, and it's particularly true with the tension that you're talking about there between the need to think about us as organizations and leaders as forces for the greater good, if you like, while actually we have a duty of care to our stakeholders and shareholders and employees, and it's not an easy balance to get through. I'm not sure whether you would like to name names here, but if there are conscious leaders who are getting that balance right that you admire, who would they be?
Well, you find conscious leader in the political realm, and you find it in the business realm as well. I think companies that have made a significant efforts to be more conscious are well known, right? There's consumer good companies like Patagonia, for example. There's political leaders. The examples are very, very well known, and typically they get a Nobel Prize for Peace, who say, I'm not going to just look at the short term, but I'm going to make the hard decisions to look for a greater outcome, even if it comes at a significant personal cost. Because ultimately, I think this is what we're talking about. Am I willing to pay a certain personal cost in order to do what is right? And of course, it's easy to convince ourselves that we are doing what is right by serving the shareholders. But you said it yourself, right? We want to be in service of all the stakeholders. So there may be some amount of personal cost to bear if you want to do that, right? Including, for example, joining corporations or working in service of corporations that may not be so focused on growth and profitability. And there's many of them. Another example, I find great inspiration, for example, in the Nordics. And it's not to say everything is rosy and everything, right? I'm not naive, but you go to companies that have this work ethics, and you find that in the Mittelstand in Germany, these mid-cap companies that are still family-owned. that want to do what is right for their employees and for their communities. You find that in Holland, you find that in Denmark, in Norway, in Sweden, in Iceland. Right? So it seems like Northern European countries, in parts at least, have reached a higher level of consciousness, and they're a little bit ahead of the pack in terms of saying, corporations have a responsibility to be honorable members of society. And therefore, for example, you find that the pay differences between the CEOs and the employees are much, much less wide than what you would have in more capitalistic economies like the US or the UK, for example, or Asia for that matter, where you can find, insane pay differences in between the CEO and the employees. So
yeah, I'd have to agree.
I think there's many examples, right? I don't want to take any company in particular. There's a lot of companies that do good, and you tend to find them in those among those that are family owned, because obviously you don't have this quarterly pressure of the stock market to just deliver one number. When you're focused on one number, your life becomes extremely shallow, because everything leads to that number, and something that doesn't have an impact on this number is ignored. And so we go back to the beginning of our discussion, right? There's an entire world that will get ignored because it doesn't have an impact, or it might even have a negative impact on that number.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you. And I'd go back to the point that you made. I think often it's small, medium businesses who seem to be more agile in order to pivot around this, with whether they're a family owned or a private owned business. And you're very right about those insights about Northern Europe. When I'm thinking about it and thinking about a couple of the clients that I've dealt with, Husqvarna, Spotify, for example, very much in line with what you're saying there. And I suppose that leaders right now in our organizations, leaders and organizations, are under the microscope in perhaps one of the most challenging transformational landscapes that we've seen: the digital transformation, the workforce transformation, the need for leaders to really upskill themselves on a very steep learning curve for some of them, if they're still locked in 20th century mentality. So with those sort of short-term pressures, for numbers, for transformational progress, for development, all of those kind of things, from your experience, because you talked about talking to, hundreds of CEOs, how are the best leaders that you come across, Fabrice, balancing this kind of very delicate situation between the need for profitability, a more purpose-driven approach, looking after themselves, and also looking after others?
Yeah, look, I believe the work starts with the leadership and the CEO in particular. No one can do the work, if you're the CEO of a corporation, or you're a very senior executive in a corporation, no one can do the work for you. You have to do the work for yourself. And very often it's a journey, because as we were discussing, senior executives have not been particularly trained to be open to the inner world. They've been really focused on the world of action, the world of doing, and nobody's particularly trained unless they have a personal interest in the world of contemplation and the world of being. So I think the work starts with a certain degree of a certain element of contemplation, and I use the word in a fairly loose sense of spending time in silence and solitude and introspection. And to go back to my book is really a step-by-step guide on how to do that for people who've not necessarily had any experience doing this. So it's it doesn't start with shave your head and move to Tibet for 3 weeks, right? Because that's not going to happen. But it starts with, how about you disconnect your devices and you spend 2 hours by yourself, without phone, without gadgets, and you go for a walk in nature. And there's no agenda. And no, don't put your your music in your ears. Be with nature, be with yourself for a couple of hours and see what emerges from that experience. That would be a first step, for example. So I believe leaders need to do the work. Nobody can do the work for themselves. I can meditate for me, but I cannot meditate for you. I can spend time in retreat for myself, but I cannot spend time in retreat for you. So they have to do the work. From doing this work, which I call loosely, as we said, contemplation, arise a number of insights. Now, I'm not promising that you're going to be enlightened in the Buddhist sense of the word. You're not going to have necessarily a Satori experience, as the Zen masters would call it, but I can guarantee that you're going to have insights into yourself, into your life, and into your action to bring it back to the outer world that you've never had before. Why? Because you've never taken, not you, I'm sure you have, but when I speak to a leader, I say, you've never really taken the time to listen to your inner voices. You've never taken the time to be in silence, right? You're always connected 24/7. You always have a phone. You're always reachable, email, WhatsApp. There's always something to do. And you're rarely alone because you work so hard that when you finally have some time, some free time, you're probably going to want to spend it with your family, with your loved ones, with your friends. And most CEOs I know tend to be social. There's a majority of extroverts. There's, of course, a few introverts, but they also have families. And if they spend 12 hours or 14 hours a day at work, they want to spend time with their families. And I understand that. But taking time out to be by yourself is actually an investment in yourself, which ultimately becomes an investment in your family because you come back as a changed person. And so I'm really advocating the marriage of contemplation and action. I'm never going to tell a CEO or a senior executive, stop being in the world of action. That is not realistic and that's not who they are. But action without contemplation can lead to all the excesses that we know. Just like contemplation without action is a bit of a waste of time. It's fine if you decide to be a monastic, but otherwise it's not practical. So balancing contemplation and action is really what I'm advocating for in my book. The world of doing and the world of being, the world of telling others what to do and the world of listening to your inner voices.
Yes, yeah, we are human beings, not human doings, right? So yeah, we have to be first. While you're talking there, it strikes me that leaders who are tuning into this will absolutely recognize this and want to do something. While many leaders also, as we know, there is an increase in anxiety, in stress, in their own mental health at leadership level. We've been so focused on the employees as we came through the pandemic and so on and so on. And leaders are starting to reflect on themselves a little bit. And yet many are immobilized as far as the first steps that they can take in this. And one thing that struck me is that your book, The Art of Retreats, as we talked about before, it's aimed at enhancing that self-awareness, productivity, decision-making, getting that balance between contemplation and doing, as you talked about, and helping leaders lead more consciously, probably themselves first. So between your book and the retreats that you also run, could you tell us how these work and how that can help leaders make progress in terms of what you're talking about?
Well, it's gradual work. And so when I lead a corporate retreat, usually I do that with my colleagues, and it's for the CEO and the executive team. So we have to be a little bit cautious and not go push people out of the comfort zone or into a direction that they would not be comfortable with. So we tend to not, for example, we very often introduce meditation and mindfulness practices for the executive team. But we're very sensitive to is this the right time? Is the team at that point in time really receptive to this, or do they have emergencies that they need to be dealing with, and in which case, we need to support them in dealing with emergencies, and it's not the right time. So, but to make the story simple, we do bring executive teams in a place where they can be more restful and more in tune with themselves. So how do we do that? And it's highly practical, right? Number one, we try to get out of the city. Cities have this vibe, this noise, this agitation. Lights are on 24/7. And so while I love living in the city, this is not the right place for a retreat if we can go in nature. So I try to bring my executive clients into nature. That's the first thing. There's research clearly supporting the fact that when we are connected to nature, our stress levels tend to decrease. We start to become more open. And look, a lot of the experiences of awe and wonder, etc., happen in nature when we watch a sunset or a lake and the mountains, etc. So last week, I took the CEO and the leadership team of a very large Indonesian tech company, and we went outside of Jakarta, and the room that we had was facing a volcano. It was a beautiful room with windows on three sides, and the view on Gunung Salak, which is a volcano, about 50 kilometers south of Jakarta. You may have been there, near Bogor. So step number one. Step number two, leave your phones. Now, I'm not one to tell executives what to do. I truly believe in the power of people discovering what they have to do for themselves. And so there's no rules in the retreats, but what we do is we typically sit our executives in a circle. We remove all the tables. Tables are terrible for meetings. I know it's a standard feature of every meeting room around the world. But what is the first thing that people do when you sit them at a table? They put their laptop, they open their laptop, and they check out because they start reading their emails and buying stock and texting their girlfriends or their boyfriends. As soon as you put a table in a meeting room, you've lost the crowd. So I get all the tables removed. We sit in a circle. It's very much like group therapy, and there's nowhere to hide. And the group starts regulating itself very naturally. I've done dozens of these executive retreats, and I have the most senior CEOs and senior executives in the whole of Asia running Asia's largest corporations, and I can have them sitting in a circle for 8 hours, and aside from during the breaks, you don't see a cell phone. Believe it or not. And I know it's hard to believe, but as soon as the team starts forming and they start paying attention to each other and truly listening to each other and truly holding the space for each other. And my role in this is purely to be a facilitator. I don't tell people what to do. I just create the conditions for that. But it's magic happens, right? So take people in nature out of the office, create the conditions where they can truly be with each other. And we don't use projectors. We don't use slides. As a McKinsey consultant, I'm guilty for using PowerPoints and the rest. But at this stage of my life, I don't do PowerPoint anymore. PowerPoint is good for sharing information. It doesn't transform leaders. No one has ever been transformed by reading a PowerPoint. So I get rid of all the electronics, the projectors, the screens, and I just sit my clients in a circle, and then we start working on the real issues. Right? Purpose. What is success? Visualizing success, including through meditation, right? And visualizing failure. It's 3 years from now, and we've completely failed. What happened? How did we create the conditions for our failure? Not, let's blame the outside world, the naughty regulators, the incompetent employees. No, This is the leadership team. The buck stops with you. How did you create the conditions for your failure? These very powerful visualizations, very powerful. How are we going to work together to create the conditions for success? How do we need to trust each other? But to trust each other, we need to understand each other. So are we prepared to open up and show some vulnerability and start sharing what is really going on in our lives, as opposed to pretending, having this facade where everything is fine in my life? Thank you very much. How are you doing, Bob? Oh, very good. And you, Sarah? Great. Because there's no authenticity in this. So how to recreate authenticity? So that's the work that we do in leadership retreats. Now, it doesn't go as deep as the work that I would do with a group of individual participants who want to come with me for 4 days and meditate for 4 days, and because then we can go a lot deeper. But for what, compared to what corporate teams do, usually just looking at numbers all day long, the difference with what they do with me and my colleagues is huge. So that's really what I do.
I can just imagine the power and the breakthroughs that individuals can make in a situation like that, as you describe it, that power of the pause and the power of being vulnerable, a bit more courageous, listening, all of those things, and actually talking from the heart, not the head, for a change. I'm sure many listening to this, unfortunately, may not be able to come on the retreats, but really want to make some progress. And perhaps before we end, Fabrice, what might be your top 3 tips for people tuning in to actually make a start in this, in their own contemplative leadership journey?
Actually, the book, and I'm not selling this to sell my book, but it is a how-to guide for leaders and really truly for anyone, because it's a guide of life, who wants to start on this path. And it's really a step-by-step, like 101 on how to create your own retreat. So what I'm saying is, don't pay expensive money to fly to Bali or Costa Rica and go to an organized retreat, etc. You can do it yourself in a few hours to start. Maybe once you become more comfortable with the concept of retreat, you want to extend them. But at the beginning, take a couple of hours and do it in the comfort of your own home, or go for a walk in the park, or go in a nice, cozy coffee shop that you like around the corner. And then there's very simple exercises, reflections that you do in this bubble in this container of solitude, silence, in a nice space where you want to reconnect with your soul. And that's the 4S of my retreats, right? So how to start? Very practical tip: silence. Absolutely disconnect the devices. We all love our phones. We love our tablets. We love our computers. But please do not bring them with you on your retreat. Turn them off. Have them near you if that makes you feel safer, but turn them off. Silence, right? Solitude. This is work that you have to do alone. Do that in a nice space, whether it's nature, your home, some place where you feel safe and cozy, and where you feel that the vibes and the energy is conducive to you opening up. And finally, be open to your soul. Take a blank sheet of paper, bring a notebook, a physical notebook, right, Jeremy? Not a tablet, because that defeats the purpose. A physical notebook, a pen. Start writing whatever. This is not for anyone else to read. This is just for you. Start writing what's coming up for you, your stream of consciousness, doodle, whatever. That is the first step of a retreat. And I promise anyone who listens to this and who's going to try it, that they will want to do more. There's no way, unless you this is not, and occasionally in your life this is really not the right time to do this, right? There could be things happening in your life but for most people who are in a stable mental place and sound psychological state, there's no way you cannot appreciate spending time in silence and solitude in a nice space, listening to the whispers of the soul.
Ah, the whispers of the soul. How beautifully put there as well. That silent solitude, the soul voice, and giving it some air. I really like that, Fabrice. And thank you so much for taking us through this today. I'm sure many of those leaders who are listening will want to connect, will want to get hold of your book, and maybe find out more about the retreats. How do they do all that?
Well, follow me on LinkedIn. That's very simple. My email address is also on my LinkedIn profile and in the book. So if you've read the book and you've liked it, and send me an email. And if you've read the book and you didn't like it, send me an email.
Great. Well, that's great advice. And thank you so much for being so open around this very important area for leaders. Many of us are very willing to admit what we've been through within our journey, some still struggling to make progress. And I'm sure a lot of this will unlock those first steps, that silence, that solitude, and that soul voice as you were talking about as well. So Fabrice, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for creating the space for this conversation. You see, this is a mini retreat, just the two of us. And
it does now feel a lot better for it as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. Please like, comment, and support us on your favourite platform, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch as well as listen to each episode.